It's time for Tim's Selfish Questions.
So this has been on my mind lately. So in my personal scenario, the way I'm using it, I just explained, I give I lend privately to my flipper friend when he finds a deal. Unfortunately, in the market nowadays, deals are hard to come by, deals that make sense for everyone involved. So, once I transferred my funds from my old IRA to my Advanta account, they sat, like they sat for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 months. And when they sit in a self-directed IRA without you directing it, hence the title, they sit. I mean, it's a savings account, more or less. So I guess I'm looking for some guidance, best practices. What do you do? What do other folks do when they're in my position, where my main goal is to wait for my friend to find a deal and I will give him all my money. He will do his thing, give it back. What can I do in the interim between deals? Is there a way, is it simple for me to just say, hey, Tiffany, my representative at Advanta, put it all in an ETF and just let it ride for 6 months. And then when it's ready, put it in a cash position, I'll lend it back out. Or is that too complicated? I don't know. I'm looking for some guidance there, I guess.
Could he buy Bitcoin in the interim?
I will not. Lisa, get off the Bitcoin train. You're giving me so many ulcers. Oh my God, the ulcers.
Well, because the question was asked, I will say, yes, he could buy Bitcoin with it.
No, thanks.
So it's a great question. And the answer is multifaceted. So one of the things that I found is that sometimes my IRA money is also sitting idle, but because of the
drives me crazy.
But because of the investments that I'm making, the return, even with the 6 months or 8 months idle, my return is still better than it would have been had I had the money invested all the time in certain other vehicles. Well, so this is one of the answers, is that the nature of self-directed IRAs in some cases may mean that there will be some space in there. And so you just have to calculate that in. It's part of the ROI calculation and whether it's right for you or not. Secondly, I think that some people approach me sometimes with, not in the scenario that you have typically, because I suspect that those are pretty short-term loans and they come back in basically a lump. But some people also have incremental returns. And so sometimes their cash balance is a lower amount. And so what I encourage them to do is to keep looking for, there are lots of investments that have lower thresholds. That could be precious metals, it could be cryptocurrency, it could be smaller loans, it could be incremental investment in a fund, things like that. So we don't do publicly traded securities well, and so there is a way to set up a subset of your IRA in an LLC that LLC could have a brokerage account and be kind of the cash flow hub of your IRA. It's, in the terminology, is typically called checkbook control. So that's one solution to having your IRA have the ability to get into all kinds of accounts and other types of investments. But in its raw form, we don't do publicly traded securities well. So it is one of those things where you could take a chunk of your money and transfer it back out to a bank or brokerage house IRA if you wanted to get into publicly traded securities. But more often than not, what I find is that people they'll do the calculation of how often they need to deploy the money. They will do some research about lower threshold investments, and they'll diversify within their self-directed IRA. And so, from my personal experience, I have a number of investments that produce incremental returns. So I let them build up just a little bit until I get a kind of a critical mass, and then I'm out looking for the next investment for that as well. So it really is, it's multifaceted, and I understand the angst because I have it myself. But it is one of those things that it's something that you just need to think about and make sure it's a match for you.
That's an excellent answer. That's super helpful, because it's not, angst might be the right word, But you're right. I mean, if you do the initial calculations, like the returns I'm getting on this flip, like I said, within 3-4 months, however long the project takes, are still better than I'm going to get in the majority of publicly traded stocks out there for the entire year. So if I'm waiting 8 months for that last bump at the end of the year, it's still better. So yeah, I don't know. That's super helpful though. And I'm going to do some thinking on that.
I have 2 selfish questions and I do not have a jingle.
You need a jingle.
One is on the private lending side. Can I lend to myself if I'm doing a flip or a burr project?
Ooh.
Or does it have to be
I like
to
that question.
someone else?
Great question. Unfortunately, the answer is no.
Okay.
So an IRA does have a list of people that are called disqualified persons, and that list of persons has some restrictions about how they can interact with the IRA. And most of the restrictions have to do with some kind of monetary transaction like a loan. And that the disqualified persons, the core list is the account holder and their spouse, ascendants and descendants, and the descendant spouses. So the account holder or spouse, mom and dad, grandparents, kids, grandkids, and the kids and grandkids as spouses. That set of people on that lineal ascendancy and descendancy have some restrictions, and so that's important to think about. But I will also say that my IRA siblings and the sides of the family tree, they are not disqualified. So I actually had my IRA make a loan to my brother. I had a lot of people look at me crossways like, hey, you got to loan money to your family?
Mhm.
So I'm proud to report that he paid it back in full. We're all good. But that's allowable. So it's not all family members. It's just a certain set of them.
What about if I have, and I'm thinking of a specific property that I owned in an LLC, could I lend money to the LLC to do a renovation on that property?
Also a good question. Also, unfortunately, the answer is no.
Okay.
So that list of disqualified persons is their personal finances, but also any entity that they own or control.
Okay.
So for instance, your IRA, would not be able to loan money even to your parents' IRA or your kids' IRA. So, because that's an entity that is also controlled by that disqualified person.
Yeah. Second question, and you've already kind of alluded to it, and I want to just ask a few more specifics. So with my self-directed IRA, I invested in a syndication, minimum investment $50,000. So $50,000 left my account, but there's some change left over. And it's just been sitting there. And what are some of the lower threshold numbers? I mean, can you throw out some numbers like how much would I need to invest in precious metals or cryptocurrency or some other things? Like what's the other thresholds that you would need?
So there's no guidance from the IRS or from Advanta about this, by the way.
Okay.
So more often than not, the threshold has to do with your return on investment. And what that often has to do with what we would charge for a transaction fee and things like that. So, and what you think the return is going to be. Obviously, all of this is predicated on calculating a good ROI. So, so for cryptocurrency, that's one that has a low threshold. We have one relationship set up with an exchange. So getting your money over to it allows you to trade on their exchange and you can bring it back and that kind of stuff. So that does allow for interim investment and then getting it back in cash for another investment. The small loans thing I mentioned, or any kind of fractional loan or fractional participation. Those are things to look for lower dollar amounts. The other thing that I'll mention is that, and this actually came up a lot with HSAs, is that your IRA can partner with other investors. So you don't always, and on a piece of real estate, let's say, your IRA does not have to be the sole owner. So if your IRA had a relatively small amount and my IRA had a relatively small amount and Tim's had a relatively small amount, we could actually all partner those smaller amounts on a new property and just earn the percentage of return. And that also goes for my accounts, right? So sometimes my HSA, because the contribution limit is relatively low, sometimes I'll try to partner that. So if I either on a loan or on a property, so let's just use real estate because we're talking about it. If my traditional IRA and my HSA wanted to be tenants in common on a property, they could. And so my HSA, and let's say it's, 95% owned by my traditional IRA and 5% owned by my HSA, we have to split all those bills 95-5, but the returns also come back 95-5, right? So there are ways for smaller amounts of money to be deployed and things like that. It is important to calculate the fees that we would charge because, one of the things that's interesting about our revenue model is because we don't sell any assets or take any percentage of what you're making or any of that kind of stuff, we really do it's fees for service. Okay. And unfortunately, the service to document a $10,000 investment is often exactly the same as for $1 million investment.
Mm.
Right.
And so it's the same work for us. So we kind of need to charge the same amount, but it doesn't help your ROI on that lower dollar amount.
Yeah.
So
that's a great point.
So again, this is one of those things where it has to be right for you. It has to be right for your circumstances. We tell everybody this stuff up front. It's not like it's secret, but
Right.
but it is one of those things where lower dollar amounts and lots of activity are not our best thing, unless you do this checkbook control LLC, which is essentially an LLC being a wholly owned subsidiary of your IRA, and all that activity takes place on the LLC level. So, and the thing that does is gives you some flexibility in terms of dispersing and receiving cash, and it also changes the way that we charge our fees. So often it can be less fees. So that's something to look into as well. And it's just a choice that you make as an IRA holder or not.